Ladies and gentlemen, this is Video Game Growing Pains, and we are back for probably what I think is the best Final Fantasy game ever made. We're talking Final Fantasy VI today. Now, let's get this out of the way. Yes, Final Fantasy VI was released in the States as Final Fantasy III on the SNES. That's all I'm going to say about the matter. I've covered this enough in my previous videos. The Japanese were under the impression that we were stupid and that this would never be re-released, which it was as Final Fantasy Anthology for the PlayStation and on the GBA. Now, moving on. I want to give a cursory warning. There are going to be some pretty major spoilers to this game. Yes, it is almost 2 decades old at the time of this recording. However, some video games have their endings kept secret, best kept secrets. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I will spoil a major plot point halfway through the game, and it is necessary to talk about what makes this game great and some of the necessary flaws within it. That being said, a little background. Final Fantasy VI was released at the tail end of the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo's lifespan. As such, it had benefit from all of the games that came previously building upon its hardware. The graphically impressive but now somewhat limited sprites of Final Fantasy IV were blown out of the water by Final Fantasy VI's new engine and the new sprites that were created. However, what was probably most noticeable was the Mode 7. Super Nintendo had a faux 3D-esque tool which was used in many games called Mode 7, and it was used largely to create depth or for specific traveling sequences. It was to give a very different graphical style to what was otherwise a somewhat limited system. After all, only 16 bits. But no game, save perhaps for Terranigma, used it to quite the extreme and quite the success of Final Fantasy VI. It was released in the States with the price tag varying depending on where you bought it. Some reported selling it brand new on launch day for $80 to $100. And yet this game still sold enough to become a beloved classic and one of Square's most sought-after titles. It really goes to show just how much word of mouth, Nintendo power, and the general fan loyalty to Final Fantasy had built up at this time. That being said, what do I think of the game? Well, until about 2010, it was my favorite game of all time, replaced only in that year by Odin Sphere for personal reasons. Final Fantasy VI is not a perfect game. I'm going to say that right now. It has many flaws, but to me it is what encapsulated the best parts of the Final Fantasy series. It is glorious in so many ways, and yet it's also very flawed, and it doesn't have to be perfect to be enjoyable. So let's start from the beginning. Story. Final Fantasy VI starts off with a young girl who is in the clutches of an evil empire. She is their puppet, their slave. Magic has ceased to be in the world. It's only a myth. Steam-powered technology and new forms of advancements, such as machinery, have taken up residence in the world, and magic thinking to be a myth, the entire world is surprised when a frozen, let's call it magical god, called an Esper, is discovered in a tiny mining town. So the Empire sends a strange young girl with the power to use magic and 2 soldiers to go find it. However, the Esper makes a connection to the young girl, Terra Bradford, and suddenly things start going into motion. Terra is recruited by a rebellion against the corrupt evil empire which is threatening the world, and joins with many allies trying to push it back. She discovers in herself a kinship with the Espers, a power yet untapped, and we learn the dark secret of what the Empire's power has truly been. They are harvesting the souls of gods to create their weapons. And yet it gets even darker from here. Villages destroyed, poisoned, madness wrought upon the world, a literal trek through death and hell itself. And at the end of it all, things get even worse. I will save the rest of the plot for a little later because it's important to pace these things. But that's a good synopsis. We have a much larger cast in Final Fantasy VI than we did in any of the other Final Fantasies, really. Final Fantasy IV had a relatively large cast with about 10 or 15 characters, all things considered, that came in and out of the party. They were not full-time party members. They would come, they would go. Final Fantasy VI, however, had 15 or more playable characters. A few of them came and went, but at least 15 could join your party at one point. You couldn't use them all, admittedly. You were limited to 4 per battle, but each character was specialized. Rather than going through with another iteration of Final Fantasy V using the job system, Final Fantasy VI took a different approach. It wanted each character to have personality, so not only did they give them a unique, often heartbreaking backstory, but they also gave them abilities and appearances that set them apart from their predecessors. It's very much like, what if the customization of Final Fantasy V met the strong character development, large cast, and unique skill set of Final Fantasy IV, taking the best of both 16-bit games to a new extreme. The characters were very compelling. There were the 2 kings of Figaro, the Machine's castle, which was able to submerge in the sand. One a master of machinery and weaponry, while the other was a powerful martial artist. We had Cyan, the warrior samurai, who was known for his honor, and Gao, a strange youth, covered in animal skins and with a kinship with monsters. We had demonic clown monsters, Kefka, the iconic villain of the series. We had a corrupt empire, a noble general. We even had a Sasquatch who would join your team and throw you at baddies. The cast was immense. And yet, none of them felt quite like the main character. All of them had their own part to play. Some more than others, admittedly. After all, Umar the Sasquatch could do little more than go, "Roar." But the game was packed full of content and very interesting characters. I want to mention Kefka in particular because he's a very different kind of villain than what we expect. Nowadays, people expect well-rounded villains, villains who you can understand. Kefka the demonic jester, however, is unapologetically evil, and he's so gleeful about it, so, I won't say childlike, but so happy-go-lucky with his malevolence. He doesn't care that much that people are dying, and yet he doesn't care if he gets hurt either. He's a very interesting kind of villain who's just as compelling and likable as he is completely insane and at times scary. He makes for a nice departure from your typical evil overlord or your sympathetic villain who's being controlled. It was a very nice change of pace. Unfortunately, one of the many flaws is that we don't have a strong character dynamic leading us. For the first half of the game, we have Tara Branford, but she takes a back seat to other characters at times because she's either incapacitated or has other problems occurring to her. After the halfway point, we lose Tara entirely and start up the narrative with another female lead, Celeste Scher. Granted, all this happens organically, and we meet these new characters well before they take over the plot, so we're not just thrown into a new character. But still, the game lacks from having a strong main party or a strong focus with the characters. First, it seems like it's Tara's story, then Celeste's story. That is, until you realize it's not really their story, but the story of comrades together, all of the characters as one, the story of a world's fight back against madness and oppression. And in that way, it's somewhat beautiful, seeing all the different personalities meshing together under a single cause. We have a thief who hates being called such, 2 kings, one without a crown and one with. We have a gambler who only has the world's last airship. We have an almost mute mimic who's hiding in the belly of a monster. We have Sasquatches, Mogs. We have a youth who barely speaks English, able to talk with monsters. We have a girl who can paint life into the very world itself. Such a unique, dynamic cast, and all of them feel very fleshed out in their own right. So, I will say this. If you play it the first time, you might feel there's a lacking of a strong character-driven narrative, but the characters themselves are strong enough that they will keep you coming back for more. Now, I've talked a lot about story and characters. What about the battle system? Well, it's very interesting, but it's also somewhat limited. As I said, all the characters have unique commands again, most of them far more useful than in Final Fantasy IV, and some of them a little frustrating. For example, Celeste's runic blade allows her to absorb magic, both yours and your enemies. If you're going for an all-physical party, it's quite useful. If you've got a bunch of magic users, it's almost useless. Relm also, for example, can draw enemies to create copies of them, which will use random attacks. Unfortunately, you don't choose the attacks or the targets, and they frequently miss. Same with Gao. He can go into a berserker rage and attack on his own with the abilities of monsters. Unfortunately, you can't choose them, and you don't know which monsters are good until much later. Yeah, it's a bit of a problem. That being said, all the characters have their own attacks, all of the characters have their own animations for battle, and all the characters can learn magic. It starts out only being Terra who can use magic, but she soon gains her own unique skill, Morph, and all the characters who can equip Espers in the form of Magicite crystals and train to learn magic. This is another part of the game that's a little bad. It's very grindy because Magic has its own experience meter, and in order to get it, you have to train quite hard. You get access to it while you're using the Esper, yes, but if you want to use it without the Esper, you're going to have to train up. There are dozens of Espers, and that spread over a good 15 characters, all of whom you want to learn Magic, it can feel very daunting trying to teach everyone. In fact, one of the best items in the game can only be gotten if you battle 255 battles with it equipped while being cursed. It's a great item, but it's very frustrating to deal with some of the grind. Now, granted, none of this is required. You don't need to grind, but it feels like Final Fantasy VI was built around that, and that's a bit of a shame. Graphically, the game is just stunning. As I said, they used a lot of Mode 7 to add some unique visual effects, such as when you are flying in an airship, riding a chocobo, or when something spectacular is happening, like the world changing around you. And the regular sprites are even more emotive than before. They have got probably the biggest, widest range of emotion possible. In-game cinematic-esque battle sequences are even more thought out than before and very, very compelling. Characters you don't know and can't control will often go into battle scenes, and they have their own sprites, their own animations. It showed just how much care went into crafting this game by Square. And there's not much else to say other than the graphical style. The semi-steampunk, semi-techno, semi-old world world that you are taking place in is very compelling and very interesting. It's different and yet the same from what we're used to. There is a higher focus on technology than the previous Final Fantasies, but it still maintains its fantasy roots with all the monsters going around. Now, musically, this game is one of my favorite games ever. Nobuo Uematsu created some of the most gorgeous soundtracks ever put to, well, video games. The Terra theme is one of the most heart-wrenchingly beautiful and yet quite hummable themes ever put to music. We have so many memorable character themes, such as Gao's Veld, or countless others. Perhaps the most well-known, most well-beloved theme of all is the opera theme. Yes, there is an opera in this game. It's one of the most heart-wrenchingly tragic, but also heart-wrenchingly beautiful themes ever recorded. And just for the record, so that no one decides to get on me about this, the opera theme is Aria de Mezzo Carattere. It's become so popular that even though it was recorded without voices, real opera singers in both Japan and America have put music to it and voice to it, and given it the treatment it deserves. There is just no way to describe how emotionally moving this soundtrack is, despite its limitations. This shows that Nobuo Uematsu is not only a great composer, but very good at using these limited 16-bit soundtracks to their fullest. Now, there's two more things I want to talk about. The first is the elephant in the room. Final Fantasy VI has a pacing problem. The first half of the game is very well paced. We are following characters. It's a very strong narrative, with each personality of certain characters shining through. At one point, we follow Terra. At another point, we follow Edgar, the king of Figaro, and his machine weaponry. We follow Sabin, Edgar's brother, and a martial artist. We follow Locke, the thief, and Celie Cher. We get introduced to all these new characters. Then halfway through the game, something happens. Major spoilers here. Just throwing that out there. Halfway through the game, the evil empire raises an island into the sky using the power of Espers, and tries to take the power of the Espers creators, godlike beings who are known as the Three Statues, a goddess, a demon, and a vindicator of sorts. And they win. Oh, don't get me wrong, the evil emperor is betrayed by Kefka, because Kefka is awesome, and Kefka basically becomes a god. He splits the world open and turns it into a world of ruin. From then on, the entire map changes, the entire graphical style changes, from a lush, beautiful world to something that's more dying and decaying. This would be a brilliant masterstroke if it weren't for the small pacing issues. And until recently, this was never done in games before. The villain won halfway through the game, and yet it kept going. He was literally a god with the power to nuke people, and yet he continued, and we continued trying to stop him. And that was what made the game interesting, but also a major flaw. After the world ends, our comrades are scattered, and we have to gather them together for a final strike on Kefka. The main story's narrative follows, well, Celise, Sabin, the gambler Setzer, and Edgar. That's about it. Everyone else you have to go find. The narrative doesn't tell you where they are. You're given a few hints, yes, such as a bird flying towards a mountain where Cyan is hiding, but at the same time, it's a lot of work trying to find everyone, and there's an incredibly large amount of areas. Everything in the game has changed. All the areas you knew are different. And finding everyone's a lot of work, and sometimes it doesn't have a big payoff. Tara Branford, for example, one of my favorite RPG characters, is taking care of, well, she's taking care of a village full of children and a few teenagers. She's found the love of motherhood and doesn't want to return to battle. She even gets beaten by a monster because she believes she's so weak. Granted, we have a lot of good character moments too. Tara snaps out of it, shows how strong she can be, and decides to fight for the future of children. But that narrative is one we have to go looking for. It's not one the game provides you. Hell, it doesn't even give you any good hints on how to find it. You just have to go looking in your airship for your old friends, and some of them are damn hard to find. Pacing aside, I do have to say this game is one of the deepest, most packed experiences I've ever played. Let me give you an example. I've played this game a good 15 times, maybe not all the way through, but a good 15 times growing up, between the ages of, say, 6 and 10. I didn't find out the characters had limit breaks or emergency attacks until I was 16 and I was playing the re-release. Easily one of the most insane amount of things this game has as content. When a character is low on health, for example, each of them has a unique animation, which allows them to fight and do a super move. There's no way to know how to trigger this. It's just something that might happen randomly when you're low on health. There are countless espers to find, countless secrets like the shield I told you about. It requires 255 battles to win. A fully packed arena where you can bet items and win things in return. An auction house. There are mini games. There's the Veld where you can get Gouda, meet new monsters, and fight them. At the end of the game, there are 10 super secret bosses that you can fight, and if you beat them all, you get unique prizes. Defeating the horrific Funbaba releases Terra from her responsibility as a mother, and gives you a brand new Esper. Fighting the Doomgaze, who hides in the sky and who you can never find, who will only randomly attack you while you're flying around your airship, gets you Bahamut the Dragon King. Killing 8 dragons, scattered throughout the world, some in the final boss's lair, unlocks the most powerful but the most deadly Esper of all, one that can actually kill you, the Crusader. It's truly got so much content. And one of the reasons I love the game is that the developers threw all this in there and didn't make players see it. They didn't drag you down a linear corridor. Yes, there are pacing problems, but there's so much to find in the game if you're willing to look. And the developers didn't care if you didn't find the dungeons. Even if you only just peeked into a dungeon, it was fully fleshed out, fully developed. There were so many new enemies there, so many new treasures and items, and there were countless story arcs to find. Some that weren't even necessary to the plot. At one point, we meet Gao's father, who threw him out when he was a child, and it's heartbreaking seeing it come together. You get nothing from it other than character moments. One character, Shadow, who's covered in mystery. When you sleep in an inn with him in the new world, the world of ruin, you'll see traces of his past, and you get nothing from it other than character development. This game was truly packed with so much into it that I can still find new things today, 20 years after I started playing it. And that's why I think it's the best Final Fantasy. It's aged the best. No matter how many strategy guides we have, people are still finding new things to do, new glitches to exploit, new treasures to find, new secrets that the developers snuck in there. Now, granted, this leads to one of the game's problems. There are 3 big ones. The first one is, it is a completionist nightmare. Doing everything in the game is ridiculous. I have done it. It takes ages. It takes months, and I don't mean months of just not playing, months of playing every day. It's also got the pacing problem I mentioned before, where the first half of the game is incredibly well paced, and then the second half, you're kind of left on your own to do what you want. The third problem is a bit deeper. It forces you to use gameplay styles that are not necessarily conducive to a standard RPG player. I haven't talked much about this, but at a number of points in the game, you are going to have to split your party up. Say, split them between different characters which you can switch to. Switch between a party of 3, a party of 3, a party of 4. And this happens a lot. You're going to have to use these split party members to fight multiple battles. And if one of your parties goes down, that's the end of the game. It can be quite frustrating. And at certain points in the game, you have to do unusual things to actually make it work. For example, one character, Sabin, the martial artist, he uses Street Fighter-esque moves to actually fight in combat. Quarter circle back turns and half circle forwards on your D-pad. It can be very difficult to master. But at the same time, I kind of admire it for this. It allowed a lot more depth in the puzzle solving, a lot more conducive gameplay to experimentation. Sabin's attack styles, for example, were so unique at the time that even though we'd played Street Fighter 2, none of us expected that in an RPG. It was interesting and amazing. And once again, I can't stress the amount of content. There's literally an entire dungeon hidden within the stomach of an enemy who can eat you, and it exists only on one island that is very easy to overlook. The strongest healing item in the game can be stolen from an enemy that is poisoned and will die after 2 turns that is only found on a tiny desert island. There's so much content and secrets packed into it. Now, I'm not going to say it's perfect. The grinding is a bit much. The unusual gameplay elements can be frustrating. The pacing is a bit of an issue. And, of course, there's the other elephant in the room. The fact that there just is so much to do. It's a completionist's nightmare. But I can't help but love the game for that. I love Final Fantasy VI. To me, it represents everything that Final Fantasy was building up to and should aspire to be in the future. It told a story that was focused not necessarily around a hero or a central narrative, but on the characters of a world coming together. Friendship, triumphing over sort of the ego-driven machismo that we are so frequently subjected to these days. And a game that had so much polish and so many secrets, even though it wasn't known if it would sell well or if people would even find them. All these secrets were released in a day and age before the internet. There was no way to know where all this was, and even the internet doesn't have all the secrets of Final Fantasy VI on it. I can't help but be amazed at what a marvel this game is. It had so much. It was an advancement on every level, and yet it was still very unique. You needed all your 15 characters because at the end of the game, you'd have to split your party into 3 to assault the main villain. And the main final battle is just insane, where you have to climb a mountain of gods to actually fight the demon clown himself, Kefka. The theology, the philosophy, the story, it's all very interesting and all very compelling, and I can't help but love it. Love it to death. And sadly, Final Fantasy VI, in my opinion, ended the golden era of JRPGs, in America and in Japan. Granted, RPGs had not gotten notoriety until Final Fantasy VII, which we'll talk about soon. But I think that from a mechanics standpoint, from music, graphics, storytelling, Final Fantasy VI was the greatest. No one would ever top it. And to this date, I don't think anyone really has. We've had some people come close. I'll argue for Lost Odyssey. I'll argue for Last Story. I'll argue for Xenogears. I'll argue for Odin Sphere. But Final Fantasy VI was something special that we will probably never see again. And it was also one of the few times when we realized just how much we might miss an art style, because the art changed so dramatically in the jump from 16-bit to 3D and 32-bit, from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation. But we're not talking about that next. There's one Final Fantasy in the Golden Era that I haven't talked about. We're talking about that to round out the Final Fantasies of the 16-bit generation, the Golden Era of RPGs. And it's one of the most reviled games in the series. Oh God, help us all. Next time, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Baby's first RPG. Is it really as bad as everyone says? Stay tuned and find out.